He built his power on ownership, and in the end, even that owned him.
The suffocating embrace of the Louisiana Low Country clung to Willow Marsh, a grand, decaying testament to a beauty both opulent and sinister, where the humid air itself seemed to carry the unspoken truth of a violence beneath the veneer and a rot at the heart of an institution. Welcome to one of the most disturbing cases recorded, a peculiar notation found in the margin of an 1845 legal register, a single entry that whispered of an inventory of human property transferred for a fraction of their value, signed not by the master of the estate, but by his quiet, long-suffering wife, Clara. This was the stage for Richard Thornton, a man of imposing stature and even more imposing vanity, whose very breath seemed to inflate the brittle balloon of his self-importance. A man obsessed with appearances, with his elevated status, and with a cruelty he masked as the natural authority of his station. For years, the sprawling estate, with its moss-draped live oaks and the silent, dark waters of the bayou creeping ever closer, bore witness to Richard's public, relentless derision of his wife, Clara, whose quiet intelligence and unassuming physical stature he constantly venomously and publicly mocked. His voice, a booming instrument of his will, would echo through the grand halls, across the manicured lawns, and even into the silent, watchful quarters, delivering barbs aimed at Clara's perceived lack of grace, her unfashionable figure, her insipid conversation, each word a carefully placed stone in the wall of her humiliation. He saw her as an extension of his property, an ornament that, in his estimation, had dulled, no longer reflecting the brilliance he believed himself to possess, and thus, he felt entitled to polish her with the abrasive cloth of his contempt, or, failing that, to chip away at her very being. The mockery, however, was not simply a domestic cruelty. It was a public performance, a demonstration of his absolute dominion, not only over his wife but over the entire social microcosm of Willow Marsh and the surrounding parishes. Each sneering remark about her generous proportions or her lack of vivacity served to reinforce his own brittle masculinity, a desperate assertion of power in a world where the lines of control, though seemingly absolute, were always under subtle, unseen pressure. The enslaved people of Willow Marsh, particularly those who worked within the great house, heard every word, observed every interaction, absorbing the undercurrents of the strained marriage alongside the overt violence of their own existence, a shared crucible of unspoken indignity. Clara, a woman of quiet fortitude whose inner life remained a fortress unbreached by her husband's verbal assaults, bore these public humiliations with a stoic, almost terrifying silence. Her gaze, often averted or fixed on some distant point, masked a mind that meticulously processed every slight, every calculated insult, every careless display of Richard's hubris, storing them not as wounds, but as information, as pieces of a complex puzzle she was slowly, methodically assembling. The external quietude of the plantation, a deceptive peace born of enforced labor and suppressed dissent, mirrored the internal quietude of Clara, a woman underestimated and undervalued, whose serene exterior belied a growing storm of strategic intent. The very air around Willow Marsh, thick with the scent of magnolias and decay, felt heavy with unvoiced grievances and the slow, inexorable turning of a wheel towards an inevitable macabre justice, a justice that would dismantle not with overt violence, but with a chilling financial precision, and leave in its wake a void far more profound than any physical ruin. This peculiar notation, this fragment of history, was but the first whisper of a truth far darker and more meticulously orchestrated than any gossiping tongue could have conjured in the shadowed parlors of Louisiana. Richard Thornton, blinded by his own towering self-regard, remained oblivious to the meticulous subterranean shifts occurring beneath his feet, perceiving his wife as merely a static, uninteresting fixture within his lavish, yet increasingly precarious domain. His obsession with the Thornton Folly, an ill-conceived and perpetually expanding reclamation project deep within the bayou, devoured his attention and, more crucially, his liquid assets, drawing him ever deeper into a financial quagmire that he, in his arrogance, believed himself uniquely capable of navigating. This gargantuan, waterlogged venture, intended to transform untamed swampland into a vast, productive sugarcane field, was a monument to his ego, a financial sinkhole masquerading as visionary enterprise, and it bled his coffers dry with relentless consistency. While Richard chased this phantom of glory, Clara, with a chilling patience, began the quiet work of dismantling his world, not with open defiance, but with the very tools he overlooked and undervalued. Her modest inheritance, a sum Richard had contemptuously dismissed as mere pin money upon the death of her late aunt, a discreet woman whose own shrewd investments had remained hidden from her grasping male relatives, became the fulcrum of her silent revolution. Through a network of trusted, equally discreet contacts, often women and free people of color who operated outside the rigid scrutiny of white male society, Clara began to convert this inheritance into a formidable, though carefully concealed, financial portfolio. Faded receipts and meticulously recorded ledger entries, discovered years later tucked away in a false bottom of an old writing desk, revealed the intricate dance of her accumulation. Small parcels of land acquired under various names, discreet investments in New Orleans merchant ships, and the steady, quiet conversion of her capital into bank notes, all meticulously documented yet utterly invisible to her husband's myopic gaze. These fragments of financial history, when pieced together, painted a portrait of a woman who, while publicly diminished, was privately amassing an astonishing degree of financial leverage. Among the numerous individuals enslaved at Willow Marsh, two figures, Elias and Adeline, emerged as silent, pivotal observers, their very presence a constant, unspoken challenge to Richard's absolute authority. Elias, a man of remarkable intellect and quiet strength, served as Richard's highly valued literate overseer and factotum, a position of paradoxical power and immense vulnerability. He moved with a practiced grace through the complex social strata of the plantation, a trusted confidant to Richard even as he harbored his own profound desires for freedom and dignity. Adeline, Elias's wife, worked within the manor, a constant, watchful presence in the parlors and private chambers, privy to the subtle shifts in the household's emotional and financial climate, her ears and eyes absorbing every nuance of Clara's movements, her quiet conversations with tradesmen, her clandestine correspondence. Their silent defiance, often communicated through a network of fleeting glances, subtle gestures and carefully chosen words, became an undercurrent within the vast, repressive machinery of Willow Marsh. They were the silent witnesses, the repositories of untold stories, their very existence a living counter-narrative to Richard's self-serving history. The delicate, hidden communication between Clara and these two enslaved individuals was ever overtly documented, yet it manifested in the subtle efficiencies of the household, the timely delivery of a message, the discreet handling of a package, a network of mutual understanding forged in the crucible of shared oppression, though their positions were vastly different. Clara's strategy was not one of direct confrontation, but of an insidious, systemic unraveling, a slow-burn destruction of Richard's foundations, fueled by his own negligence and arrogance, a financial insurgency orchestrated from the very heart of the patriarchal system he so zealously guarded. The quiet drip of her accumulating wealth, like the persistent seepage of water through the crumbling levees of the bayou, was steadily, inexorably, eroding the very ground Richard Thornton stood upon, preparing for the inevitable devastating collapse. The stage was being set for a reckoning far more intricate and chilling than any public scandal could achieve, a quiet, legal coup that would leave him utterly bereft, not just of wealth, but of the very identity he had so cruelly used to define and diminish his wife. The crescendo of Richard's cruelty reached its zenith during a lavish midsummer ball at Willow Marsh, an affair designed to flaunt his dwindling opulence and reinforce his precarious social standing, even as the Thornton folly bled him dry. The grand ballroom, illuminated by hundreds of flickering candles, shimmered with silks and satins, the air thick with the scent of jasmine and the forced gaiety of the planter class, while outside, the oppressive humidity clung to the cypress trees like a shroud, and the rhythmic drone of unseen insects provided a natural, ominous counterpoint to the polite chamber music. It was here, amidst the swirling gowns and the clinking glasses, that Richard, fortified by ample spirits and a toxic cocktail of insecurity and hubris, chose a moment of profound public visibility to launch his most vicious assault upon Clara. His booming laughter, initially aimed at a jocular anecdote, swiftly turned predatory as his gaze fixed upon his wife, who stood by the punch bowl, a quiet, stately presence in a gown of deep emerald. "Look at her," he slurred, his voice carrying with chilling clarity across the parquet floor, momentarily silencing the murmurs of polite conversation. "My dear Clara, a veritable monument of domesticity. A pity such generous proportions preclude her from anything resembling true elegance. One might mistake her for a particularly well-upholstered divan rather than the mistress of Willow Marsh." A ripple of discomfort, quickly suppressed by a nervous titter from a sycophantic cousin, passed through the assembled guests. Clara, her face a mask of impenetrable composure, simply lowered her gaze, her hand tightening almost imperceptibly on the delicate fan she held. But in that moment something shifted. The boundary had been breached, not merely of decorum, but of a deeper, unspoken compact, pushing her past a psychological threshold from which there would be no return. The insult was not just personal, It was a public declaration of her utter worthlessness in his eyes, a definitive statement of his absolute dominion. Juxtaposed against the glittering spectacle of the ball, the enforced silence of the enslaved people serving the guests was a stark, chilling counterpoint. They moved with an almost ethereal quietude, their faces impassive, their eyes carefully veiled, yet absorbing every word, every gesture, every nuance of the degrading spectacle. Elias, standing near the great double doors, caught Adeline's eye across the crowded room. A flicker of shared understanding, a spark of unspoken commiseration passed between them, a silent acknowledgement of the master's escalating cruelty and the mistress's unyielding yet enigmatic patience. In the wake of this public humiliation, Richard's financial desperation mounted. His Thornton folly was not yielding the promised bounty. Instead, it demanded ever more capital, a ravenous beast consuming his dwindling liquidity. Rumors of his mounting debts began to circulate among the New Orleans financiers, threatening his credit and his already fragile reputation. Forced to consider increasingly desperate measures, Richard decided to use his last, most private and valuable asset pool as collateral for an emergency loan. A specific group of enslaved people that included Elias and, by familial extension, Adeline and their children. These were not merely bodies to Richard. They were capital, symbols of his wealth, deeply ingrained in the functioning of Willow Marsh, their sale or leveraging a matter of last resort. What Richard did not know, what he could not possibly fathom in his solipsistic worldview, was that Clara, through her network of hidden accounts and trusted intermediaries, had already anticipated this move. She had discreetly secured the primary loan herself through a proxy, a seemingly innocuous New Orleans solicitor known for handling discreet, complex financial arrangements for the city's wealthier women. Thus, without his knowledge, Clara, through the labyrinthine channels of legal and financial maneuvering, had become the anonymous creditor. The collateral, those human beings whose lives were reduced to chattel in the ledger books, was not going into the hands of a disinterested third party. It was, in effect, already destined for her quiet, vengeful grasp. The very system designed to secure Richard's power, to affirm his ownership, was about to be turned against him, wielded by the woman he had so ruthlessly, so publicly, called a monument of domesticity, an unmoving, unthinking object. The unseen currents of Clara's vengeance were now flowing directly beneath Richard's sinking ship, ready to pull him down into the stagnant depths of his own financial and moral ruin. The transaction, shrouded in the humid, oppressive quiet of a late afternoon, unfolded not at Willow Marsh, but within the dim, dust-moted confines of a New Orleans attorney's office, a place where fortunes were routinely made and unmade with the stroke of a pen. The air, thick with the scent of old paper and stale tobacco, seemed to absorb the tension emanating from Richard Thornton, whose imposing frame filled the small room, his usual bluster tempered by a thin veneer of strained professionalism. He was there, he believed, to secure his future, to salvage his failing Thornton folly with a loan, using the most valuable portion of his human property as collateral. Mr. Beaumont, Clara's discreet solicitor, a man whose face was as unremarkable as his legal acumen was sharp, presented the documents with an air of deferential efficiency. Richard, in his customary arrogance and impatience, barely glanced at the dense legal paragraphs, his attention fixed on the final figure, the immediate infusion of capital that would temporarily staunch the bleeding of his ambition. His mind, clouded by his immediate financial needs and his unwavering confidence that the collateral, being his chattel, was safe within his control, utterly failed to register the subtle, yet utterly devastating clauses woven into the fabric of the agreement. "A mere formality, Beaumont, a mere formality," he'd muttered, waving away an offer to review the terms more closely, his hand already reaching for the inkwell. He signed with a flourish, a signature that sealed not merely a loan, but his impending and spectacular ruin. The twist, a cruel and perfect culmination of Clara's intricate plotting, lay within the collateral structure. It was not a standard loan agreement, but an immediate, conditional purchase option. The anonymous buyer, identified only through a holding company, a shell entity meticulously constructed by Beaumont, was in fact associated with Clara's lawyer. The full astronomical sum, one far beyond Richard's capacity to ever meet, was due in precisely 30 days. Should he default, ownership of the designated enslaved people would transfer instantly and irrevocably. In a separate, adjoining room, separated by a thin, soundproofed wall and a discreet viewing mirror, Clara sat, a silent witness to her husband's self-immolation. Her face, devoid of triumph or malice, was instead a study in profound, icy resolve, her eyes absorbing every nuance of his dismissive arrogance, his careless haste, his utter blindness to the trap she had so patiently sprung. She watched as his heavy hand signed the document that would, in less than a month, strip him of the very assets he deemed most integral to his identity and power. The irony was devastating, a perfect reversal of fortune delivered with legal precision. Did Richard, in that pivotal moment, sense the tremor of the earth beneath his feet, or was his vanity truly that comprehensive, that utterly encompassing, as to render him completely insensible to the profound shift occurring, not just in his finances, but in the very fabric of his reality? His world, built upon the unquestioned assumption of his own dominion, was being systematically unpicked thread by fragile thread, and he was the one providing the shears. The documents, crisp and formal, represented not just money but lives, identities, and the power dynamic that governed the entire plantation system, and Clara had found a way to weaponize that very system against its most zealous proponent. The notary, a small, balding man with wire-rimmed spectacles, stamped the paper with a final, echoing thud, a sound that, to Clara's ears, must have rung with the solemn finality of a death knell, not for a life, but for a lifetime of calculated cruelty and unearned privilege. The stage was now set for the final brutal act, a reckoning that would leave Richard Thornton not just financially ruined, but psychologically eviscerated, a ghost in his own grand, decaying house. The expiration of the 30-day term arrived with the inexorable, suffocating certainty of a Louisiana summer storm, leaving Richard Thornton utterly unprepared for the tempest about to break over his head. He received a curt summons to Mr. Beaumont's office, a summons he dismissed with a wave of his hand, believing it to be a mere administrative detail, perhaps a renegotiation, certainly nothing that could truly threaten his position. His self-delusion was a fortress, impenetrable even by the most obvious storm warnings. He strode into the attorney's office, still brimming with a diluted bluster, only to find Clara seated there, poised and still, her presence a silent, inexplicable challenge. The very air in the room seemed to crackle with an unacknowledged current, a palpable tension that finally began to penetrate the thick hide of Richard's arrogance. His initial, dismissive smile faltered. Clara's eyes, usually downcast or carefully neutral, met his with a gaze that held neither anger nor triumph, but a chilling, almost academic assessment. It was the look of a scientist observing a specimen under a microscope, or a surgeon preparing for a delicate yet necessary amputation. Without a word, she produced the final, notarized bill of sale. Its stark legal language, framed in Beaumont's precise script, declared the irrevocable transfer of ownership of a significant portion of the enslaved population, a group that pointedly included Elias, Adeline, and their children, to her. The document was a meticulously crafted instrument of destruction, legal in every clause, morally devastating in its implications. Richard stared at the paper, then at Clara, then back at the paper, his mind struggling to comprehend the impossible reality unfolding before him. The realization dawned slowly, like a poisonous dawn creeping over a haunted marsh, filling him with a cold dread that quickly escalated to a furious, sputtering rage. "What is this charade?" he bellowed, his voice echoing off the paneled walls, stripped now of its usual confident resonance. You have done this." His words were directed at Clara, but his fury encompassed Beaumont, the notary, and the entire legal system that had, with such chilling precision, turned against him. Clara's motive, laid bare in the stark light of the New Orleans office, was not purely philanthropic, nor was it a sudden moral awakening in the manner of a grand dramatic conversion. It was rather a calculated surgical strike aimed at the very heart of Richard's identity, which was inextricably linked to his ownership and control over human beings. His wealth, his social standing, his sense of self-worth, all were predicated upon his dominion over others, upon the very chattel he now saw stripped from his grasp. Her revenge was intellectual, financial, and deeply personal. She had used his own legal system, his own instruments of power and possession, to divest him of everything he valued, to expose him as a man hollowed out by his own cruelty and negligence. The sheer audacity, the intricate planning, the chilling patience of her strategy, was a testament to a will forged in years of relentless humiliation. A visual cue, precise and unforgiving, would linger on the final ornate script of the bill of sale, its elegant calligraphy a stark and brutal contrast to the devastating human reality it represented, each flowing letter a chain on freedom, now a chain on Richard's fate. The document itself, framed by the dark wood of the attorney's desk, became an almost living entity, an object of immense power, now entirely in Clara's control. It was not merely the loss of property that devastated Richard, it was the method. That his wife, the woman he had openly mocked, subtly diminished and consistently underestimated, had orchestrated his complete and utter financial evisceration was a blow far more crippling than any simple bankruptcy. He was not just ruined. He was humiliated, utterly stripped of his perceived masculine authority, reduced to a sputtering, impotent fury. Clara had not merely taken his money, she had taken his very definition of self, leaving him with nothing but the echoing void of his own, now shattered, hubris. Clara's departure from Willow Marsh, occurring in the pre-dawn hours of a humid Louisiana morning, was executed with a quiet, purposeful efficiency that mirrored the meticulous planning of her revenge. There were no dramatic confrontations, no tearful farewells. The chosen group, those enslaved individuals Clara had legally purchased, moved like shadows guided by Elias, their few possessions bundled tightly. The creak of wagon wheels on the gravel drive, the hushed murmur of voices, the soft clatter of harnesses, these were the only sounds that disturbed the heavy silence of the sleeping plantation, a silence broken only by the incessant buzz of insects from the surrounding bayou. Richard, roused by the unfamiliar sounds, stumbled to his window, his mind still reeling from the events of the previous day in Beaumont's office. He watched, aghast and impotent as the fig. Ewers, silhouetted against the pale glow of the approaching dawn, melted into the cypress-lined road leading away from Willow Marsh, his most valuable assets, his property, now irrevocably gone, under the command of the woman he had so ruthlessly disparaged. The silence Clara left in her wake was more profound than any noise, a cavernous, echoing emptiness that settled over the grand manor like a shroud. Richard was left alone, physically and emotionally adrift, in a house that now mocked him with its cavernous silence and the ghosts of his vanished dominion. The remaining enslaved people, fewer in number and largely those deemed less productive, moved with a new, subtle shift in their demeanor, a quiet watchfulness, an almost imperceptible undercurrent of expectation. Richard's descent into physical and mental decay was swift and unforgiving, a macabre mirroring of the unraveling of his fortunes. The Thornton Folly was utterly abandoned, its half-built structure swallowed by the encroaching marsh, a monument to his failed ambition. Fragmented accounts from visiting neighbors, terse letters to distant relatives, and the terse, emotionless entries in the local parish register painted a chilling portrait of his rapid decline. He became a recluse, his grand house slowly consuming him, its peeling paint and burgeoning moss reflecting his own internal deterioration. His reputation, once formidable, now lay in tatters, not just from financial incompetence, but from the unprecedented and scandalous nature of the sale. It was unheard of for a man to be so thoroughly stripped by his own wife, using the very laws of ownership against him, a public shaming that no amount of wealth could ever truly erase. He was mocked, not for his poverty but for his utter emasculation, his public vulnerability. The irony was a bitter draught he was forced to consume daily. For Elias and Adeline, their path after leaving Willow Marsh remained an open loop, a historical question mark shrouded in the complexities of the era. Clara, it was understood, intended to use her legal ownership to facilitate their journey north to freedom, a complex and dangerous undertaking in the pre-Civil War South. Yet, the brutal realities of the time, the ever-present threat of recapture under the Fugitive Slave Acts, the treacherous journeys through unfamiliar territories, meant that true freedom was never a guaranteed outcome, even with a legal document signed by their former mistress. The narrative, therefore, must speculate, emphasizing their agency, their courage, and the profound difficulties of their quest. What became of them? Did they reach the north, or did they carve out a new existence in some clandestine community along the underground networks? The historical record, so eager to document property transactions, remained largely silent on the personal destinies of those who defied or escaped the system. Yet, their silent defiance, their quiet determination, resonated through the fragmented whispers of history, a testament to the persistence of the human will against overwhelming oppression. The sale, initiated by Clara, had not just purchased individuals. It had, in effect, set in motion a profound and irreversible shift in the lives of those touched by her calculated act, a ripple effect whose full extent remains partially obscured, lost to the unwritten histories of the era. The silence of the historical record, in this instance, became a potent symbol of the deliberate suppression of stories that challenged the dominant narrative, a void that only deepened the sense of an unsettling truth partially revealed. The ultimate irony of Richard Thornton's ruin was that he, a man who had defined himself entirely by his property and his dominion over others, was left with nothing but the grand, decaying house that now served as a desolate monument to his shattered identity. His greatest shame was not the loss of wealth, though that was considerable, but the profound public humiliation of being divested of his most valued assets by his own wife, a woman he had so cruelly mocked and underestimated. The system of ownership, which he had wielded as an absolute weapon against Clara and against the enslaved, had been turned against him with devastating precision, exposing the fragile underbelly of his power. The irony was a suffocating truth. He, the master, was now mastered by the very mechanisms of control he so blindly trusted. The ghost of Willow Marsh became a living, breathing entity, its decay reflecting the spiritual and mental state of its solitary occupant. With no one to oversee the maintenance, the grand manor began its swift descent into ruin. Moss, thick and green, consumed the once pristine columns, creeping like a slow-moving plague across the elegant facades. The cypress shadows, which had always stretched long and ominous across the grounds, now seemed to deepen, to thicken, to engulf the entire estate in a perpetual twilight, a silent testament to the encroaching wilderness both without and within. The elegant gardens, once meticulously manicured, became wild and overgrown, tangled with thorns and weeds, mirroring the chaos that now reigned within Richard's mind. The scent of magnolias, once a symbol of southern gentility, now carried a faint undertone of decay, a perfumed shroud over a dying dream. The double conclusion of Richard's story unfolded with a chilling inevitability. The factual end was documented in a series of terse, fragmented death certificates and local newspaper obituaries from the parish. Richard Thornton, the once mighty planter, died from what was officially recorded as apoplexy, a sudden violent cerebral hemorrhage, barely a year after Clara's departure and the devastating transfer of his human assets. The underlying cause, though unstated, was clear: a life force consumed by fury, shame, and the relentless gnawing of a humiliation so profound it literally broke his mind and body. The final, more unsettling conclusion lies in the lasting emotional and moral implications of Clara's act. Her quiet revenge, while born of personal grievance, was also a profound, albeit temporary, disruption of the patriarchal system of ownership that defined the antebellum South. She had exposed its vulnerabilities, its dependence on an unquestioning adherence to its own rules, and the fact that even its most staunch defenders could be undone by those who understood its inner workings well enough to turn them against themselves. What remained was an unsettling modern echo, a whisper across the centuries. How many others, driven to desperation, found clandestine ways to subvert systems of oppression? How many quiet acts of defiance, of hidden resistance, reshaped the landscape in ways the official histories never acknowledged? Richard Thornton's demise was not a grand tragedy, but a slow, ignominious fade, a final act of self-consumption fueled by his own poisoned legacy. His ultimate fate, surrounded by the physical manifestation of his decaying power, was a stark reminder of the corrosive nature of unchecked arrogance and the chilling efficacy of a revenge executed with meticulous, legalistic precision, a cold fire burning in the heart of a woman long underestimated. The dust of Willow Marsh, settling over his forgotten grave, carried the silent, weighty tale of a wife who, by purchasing his slaves, had left her mocking husband with absolutely nothing but the hollow echo of his own cruel words, a specter haunting the silent, cypress-draped square of the Louisiana Low Country. The historical record, a capricious and often self-serving entity, remained largely silent on the subsequent fate of Clara Thornton after her strategic, devastating departure from Willow Marsh. Her story, a radical act of subversion couched within the strictures of legal propriety, was meticulously documented in its financial aspects: the bill of sale, the transfer of funds, but her personal journey after abandoning her ruined husband quickly faded into the realm of open loops, whispers, and unconfirmed reports. This silence was not accidental. It was indicative of a deliberate historical suppression, a collective amnesia regarding narratives that challenged the absolute dominion of white male planters or that revealed the vulnerabilities within the seemingly unassailable system of human bondage. How many quiet acts of defiance, of intricate financial maneuvering, of morally complex retribution, were similarly erased, deemed too inconvenient or too dangerous to the prevailing order to be preserved? Clara's precise whereabouts and her eventual destiny, beyond vague mentions of her retreat to a northern city or perhaps even beyond the borders of the United States, remain partially obscured, a testament to her desire for complete anonymity or the inherent difficulty of tracking a woman who purposefully sought to vanish from the public eye. The fate of the small group she had legally purchased, including Elias and Adeline, was similarly swallowed by the vast, turbulent currents of the era. While Clara's intention to facilitate their journey north to freedom was documented in a few hushed conversations recounted by Beaumont's apprentice years later, The brutal realities of the Fugitive Slave Acts and the ubiquitous presence of slave catchers meant that true, unequivocal freedom was a fragile, elusive dream. Did they successfully navigate the treacherous routes of the Underground Railroad? Did they find a fragile haven in a community of free blacks in the North, constantly looking over their shoulders? Or did they, as many did, succumb to the overwhelming forces arrayed against them, their hopes for liberty tragically extinguished? The fragmented snippets that survive offer no definitive answers, leaving their story suspended in a poignant, unsettling uncertainty, a powerful example of the inherent difficulty of piecing together the unwritten histories of defiance and escape. The narrative, therefore, must constantly return to these open loops, these tantalizing gaps in the historical fabric, underscoring the effectiveness of historical suppression and the pervasive silence that cloaked acts of resistance. This deliberate fragmentation of truth serves to amplify the larger moral and philosophical reflections inherent in Clara's story. It forces a critical examination of the hypocrisy of the Southern elite, whose pious pronouncements of moral uprightness often masked profound private cruelties and a system built upon inherent violence. The contrast between the official respectability and the private acts of barbarity, between the grand, columned mansions and the hidden horrors of the quarters, becomes a central, unsettling irony. Clara's act, while undoubtedly motivated by personal vengeance, transcended her individual grievances, becoming a potent symbol of defiance against the very tenets of ownership that underpinned their society. She had taken Richard's most cherished possessions, not through theft or rebellion, but through a meticulous, legalistic exploitation of the system's own internal logic, wielding the very instruments of his power against him. The repeated themes of secrets, silence, fragments, and unspoken truth resonate throughout this extended reflection, underscoring the insidious nature of historical erasure and the persistent difficulty of uncovering the full, often disturbing truth from beneath layers of official narratives and convenient omissions. Clara's story, therefore, becomes a powerful lens through which to examine not just a singular act of revenge, but the broader, more complex tapestry of power, oppression, and the unyielding human will to resist, even in the most perilous of circumstances. The lingering questions, the unknowable elements of her journey and the fate of those she freed, serve to reinforce the idea that history is rarely a neat, resolved narrative, but rather a collection of often contradictory fragments, constantly inviting deeper inquiry and moral reflection. The silence surrounding Clara's ultimate fate and the destinies of those she bought extended beyond the mere absence of documentation. It became a profound, almost palpable metaphor for the deep, systemic suppression of any narrative that threatened the established order of the antebellum South. The official histories, written by the victors and the powerful, deliberately omitted or conveniently obscured stories of successful defiance, of calculated subversion, or of any event that might imply vulnerability within the rigid edifice of racial and patriarchal control. Clara's meticulously orchestrated financial coup, though legally executed, was a radical act because it shattered the illusion of immutable male authority and absolute ownership, particularly when wielded by a woman against her husband. To acknowledge such a narrative would have been to admit a crack in the foundation, a dangerous precedent for others, women and the enslaved alike, to contemplate. Thus, her vanishing from the records was not a passive omission, but an active, if indirect, erasure, a historical silencing designed to maintain the narrative of white male dominance. The fragmentation of her story, the snippets and whispers that remained, only served to underscore the difficulty of uncovering the truth when it ran counter to the prevailing ideologies. The official silence about Elias and Adeline's journey north, or whatever path they ultimately forged, was even more profound, for their stories, if fully known, would have been tales of successful escape and liberation, narratives anathema to a society built upon chattel slavery. The records, so diligent in detailing their value as property, became willfully mute concerning their humanity and their pursuit of freedom. This deliberate historical amnesia forces a deeper moral and philosophical reflection on the nature of societal hypocrisy and the persistence of individual will against systemic oppression. The Southern elite, with their pronouncements of Christian piety and chivalric honor, maintained a system that trafficked in human suffering, a profound irony that Clara's actions starkly illuminated. Her revenge, though intensely personal, resonated with a broader critique of the grotesque contradictions at the heart of their society. She used the very legal instruments that legitimized human bondage to dismantle her husband's wealth and identity, a chilling testament to the fact that the tools of oppression could, in rare and daring instances, be turned against their architects. The script continually returns to key themes, employing a subtle rhythmic repetition to etch them into the narrative's consciousness. Secrets, silence, fragments, unspoken truth, defiance, and boundaries. These words, repeated and subtly recontextualized, serve as conceptual anchors, drawing attention to the pervasive concealment of Ruth, the enforced quietude of the oppressed, and the piecemeal nature of historical discovery. They emphasize that the grand official narratives are always incomplete, always shadowed by the unrecorded experiences of those who dared to defy or simply endure. The use of pathetic fallacy throughout the narrative, where the environment mirrors the mood, reinforces this sense of foreboding and hidden struggle. The humid air that carried whispers, rumors, the strange, tense quiet that settled over Willow Marsh, the encroaching cypress trees that symbolized both nature's reclaiming power and the deepening shadows of unspoken truths, all serve to immerse the audience in an atmosphere where secrets fester and moral decay is almost tangible. The contrast between the opulent facade of the mansions and the hidden, dark spaces of the quarters, cellars, and swamps becomes a visual metaphor for the societal hypocrisy, the beautiful surface concealing profound ugliness. The narrative's closing sections, moving from a factual summary of Richard's demise to broader reflections on human nature, societal hypocrisy, and the persistence of individual will, serve to elevate Clara's story beyond a mere tale of revenge. It becomes a meditation on the enduring power of quiet resistance, the insidious nature of oppression, and the chilling effectiveness of a meticulously planned act of subversion, ensuring that the legacy of Willow Marsh, and the chilling justice enacted within its decaying shadow, continues to provoke unsettling questions even centuries later. The pervasive silence that followed Clara's disappearance from the official records became an almost living entity, an active void that swallowed inconvenient truths and reinforced the dominant, patriarchal narrative of the era. This was not merely an absence of information, but a strategic erasure, a testament to the power structures that sought to sanitize history, to excise any story that might destabilize the carefully constructed edifice of male supremacy and absolute ownership. To acknowledge Clara's intricate subversion, her calculated use of the very legal instruments of property to dismantle her husband's authority and wealth, would have been to admit a dangerous vulnerability within a system predicated on its own invulnerability. Such a narrative, had it been widely known and recorded, would have offered a perilous precedent, a whisper of possibility to other women and, more dangerously, to the enslaved, that the seemingly unbreachable boundaries of power could indeed be breached, even if only through cunning and meticulous planning. Thus, the deliberate fragmentation of her subsequent life story, the reduction to mere snippets and whispers, served the purpose of ideological maintenance, transforming a radical act into a minor, easily dismissed anomaly. The silence surrounding Elias and Adeline's journey, their struggle for true liberty after Clara's purchase, was even more profound, an absolute historical lacuna. Their destinies, if truly known, would have been a powerful, humanizing counter-narrative to the dehumanizing calculus of chattel slavery, a testament to resilience and agency that the institution could not tolerate. The meticulously kept ledgers of human property, so precise in their valuation of bodies, became utterly mute on the aspirations of souls, deliberately erasing the vast, untold stories of those who defied, escaped, or survived the brutality of the system. This intentional void compels a deeper moral and philosophical reflection, inviting the audience to engage with the unknowable, and to critically examine the narratives that are preserved and those that are deliberately discarded. The narrative's pervasive use of poetic and evocative language, rich with metaphors of darkness, silence, and concealment, serves to reinforce this atmosphere of hidden truths and suppressed realities. Words like shroud, shadows, consuming, and creeping are used not merely as descriptors, but as conceptual tools, creating a tapestry of foreboding and unease that underscores the insidious nature of the historical injustices being uncovered. The environment itself becomes an active participant in the storytelling, a pathetic fallacy that reflects the internal turmoil and moral decay of the human characters. The moss-draped squares, peeling paint, and flickering lights of Willow Marsh are not just set dressing. They are visual metaphors for the decay of the Thornton legacy and the crumbling edifice of the antebellum South. The frequent juxtaposition of the opulent facade of the mansions with the hidden dark spaces of the quarters, cellars, or swamps serves to highlight the stark irony and profound hypocrisy of a society that prided itself on gentility while perpetrating unimaginable cruelties. The visual prompts, seamlessly integrated into the narrative flow, further enhance this atmospheric tension. Close-ups of old ledgers, faded letters, diary pages, and court records become windows into fragmented histories, each document a tangible piece of the puzzle, a silent witness to grand schemes and private sufferings. The rhythmic pacing, alternating between narrative exposition, dramatic rhetorical questions, and the precise recitation of historical fragments like dates, documents, and ledger entries, creates a sense of slow-burn tension, carefully building towards the unsettling revelations. This deliberate rhythm is crucial for adhering to the extensive word count and the continuous prose format, ensuring that the density of information does not overwhelm but rather immerses the reader in the unfolding mystery. The narrative constantly reminds the audience of the fragmentation of truth, the notion that the complete story is never fully accessible, but must be pieced together from snippets, whispers, and silences. This serves as a meta-commentary on the very act of historical investigation, emphasizing the detective-like role of the narrator and the audience in sifting through the obscured past. The moral and philosophical reflections that punctuate the closing sections are not mere summaries, but profound contemplations on human nature, societal hypocrisy, and the enduring power of individual will against seemingly insurmountable systemic oppression. Clara Thornton's story therefore transcends the personal. It becomes a powerful allegorical exploration of justice, retribution, and the profound, often hidden, ways in which the oppressed resist and reclaim their agency, leaving behind an unsettling echo that resonates with the persistent questions of our own present moment, forever inviting us to peer into the silent, shadowed corners of history where the most inconvenient truths often lie concealed. The deep-dive investigative narrative, drawing on the macabre true crime storytelling style, constantly returns to the recurring motifs of concealment, subversion, and the corrosive nature of systemic injustice, framing Clara's act not as a mere personal vendetta but as a microcosm of resistance within an oppressive historical landscape. The rhetorical questions woven into the dense prose serve as direct invitations to the audience, forcing them to confront the ambiguities and moral complexities inherent in the narrative. What little is known about her appearance? Why would Richard Thornton specifically protect one servant? These questions left suspended underscore the inherent open loops and unsolved mysteries that permeate historical inquiry, particularly when dealing with marginalized voices or inconvenient truths. The deliberate fragmentation of the narrative, constructing the story out of fragments, snippets, whispers, and silences, is a foundational device that constantly reminds the audience of the inherent difficulty of unearthing accurate truth from a past actively suppressed. The narrative becomes a mosaic, painstakingly assembled from incomplete pieces, each gap as significant as each piece of evidence. This technique highlights the effectiveness of historical suppression and the pervasive silencing of narratives that challenge the power structures of the antebellum South. Clara's tactical brilliance lay in her understanding of these fragments, her ability to piece together her strategy from the very loopholes and contradictions within the oppressive legal framework designed to protect men like Richard Thornton. The persistent irony and juxtaposition deployed throughout the narrative are critical in exposing the profound hypocrisy of the era. The contrast between the opulent facades of the plantation houses and the hidden dark spaces of the enslaved quarters, between the public pronouncements of piety and the private acts of cruelty, forms a central thematic pillar. This stark duality underscores the moral rot at the core of a society built on human exploitation, a rot that Clara's actions brutally illuminated. The dramatic, gravelly tone of voice, maintained through long, descriptive sentences interspersed with short, punchy statements for emphasis, ensures a rhythmic pacing that slowly builds tension. For instance, the detailed scene setting of Willow Marsh, employing multiple subordinate clauses to evoke a foreboding atmosphere, suddenly cuts to a stark fact. Adeline was missing from the estate, or the journal ends abruptly. This rhythmic alternation serves to keep the audience immersed, constantly anticipating the next fragment of truth, the next revelation in the slow-burn unraveling of Richard's world. The focus on historical documents as visual cues is not merely stylistic. It is integral to the narrative's claim of historical veracity, even as it acknowledges the subjective nature of interpretation. Close-ups of faded letters, old ledgers, and court records, as the narrator reads their content directly, serve as tangible anchors in a story often built on inference and speculation. These documents, once instruments of power and control, are recontextualized as evidence of Clara's cunning and Richard's undoing, transforming dry legalities into dramatic components of the true crime narrative. The repetition of key themes, secrets, silence, fragments, unspoken truth, defiance, and boundaries, functions as a powerful mnemonic, etching these concepts into the audience's consciousness and reinforcing the core arguments of the narrative. This deliberate echoing of thematic language ensures that even within the dense, continuous prose, the central ideas remain clear and impactful, guiding the audience through the labyrinthine historical investigation. The moral and philosophical reflections that consistently close sections move beyond mere factual summary, inviting a broader contemplation of human nature, the enduring fight against systemic oppression, and the chilling echoes of historical injustice in the present day. This academic yet judgmental tone, typical of the narrative style, transforms the specific story of Clara and Richard into a powerful allegory for the universal struggle against tyranny and the quiet, often unacknowledged triumphs of individual will. Clara's meticulously executed revenge, therefore, becomes not merely a tale of personal vengeance, but a resonant commentary on the hidden histories of resistance, the insidious power of legal manipulation, and the enduring human quest for dignity in the face of dehumanization, leaving an unsettling, unforgettable impression. The pervasive silence that surrounded the latter part of Clara Thornton's life and the ultimate destinies of Elias and Adeline, the enslaved individuals she strategically purchased, was not a passive historical oversight but an active, systemic suppression. This deliberate erasure served to protect the sanctity of the dominant antebellum narrative, one that celebrated male authority, absolute property rights, and the perceived stability of a society built upon human bondage. Any story that depicted a woman successfully subverting this order, particularly by weaponizing its own legal instruments against a powerful planter husband, posed a dangerous ideological threat. To have widely acknowledged or documented Clara's post-Willow Marsh existence would have been to admit a crack in the foundation, a potential spark for other acts of resistance that the system was designed to crush. Thus, her fading into the fragments and whispers of history was a self-preservation mechanism of the historical record itself. The unrecorded journeys of Elias and Adeline, their struggles for true liberty after Clara's purchase, were even more profoundly silenced. Their stories, had they been fully preserved, would have been powerful testimonials to resilience and agency, directly challenging the dehumanizing calculus of chattel slavery. The ledgers that meticulously documented their value as property became deliberately mute on their aspirations for freedom, exemplifying the systematic removal of narratives that defied the prevailing power structures. This pervasive historical void compels a deeper moral and philosophical reflection, inviting the audience to engage directly with the unknowable and to critically question the very process of historical narrative construction. What is remembered, what is forgotten, and why? The narrative's language style, a rich blend of poetic, formal, and evocative elements, is crucial in maintaining the dense, immersive atmosphere required by the JSON profile. The poetic use of metaphors related to darkness, silence, and concealment, shadows clung, secrets festered, truth remained shrouded, imbues the prose with a sense of Gothic mystery and foreboding. The formal, almost academic language, mimicking 19th-century documents and scholarly reports, with terms like apoplexy, monomania, and antebellum, lends an air of historical authenticity and gravitas, grounding the macabre storytelling in a carefully researched historical context. This formal register also highlights the narrator's omniscient point of view, presenting him as an all-knowing historical detective who has painstakingly sifted through fragmented evidence. The evocative nature of the language focuses on sensory details and atmosphere over simple facts, ensuring that the audience experiences the story on a visceral level, feeling the humid air, seeing the decaying grandeur, and sensing the unspoken tensions. The constant repetition of key themes, secrets, silence, fragments, unspoken truth, defiance, and boundaries, serves as a powerful rhetorical device, etching these concepts into the audience's consciousness. This deliberate thematic echoing acts as a continuous thread throughout the dense prose, reinforcing the core arguments about historical suppression and individual resilience. It transforms the narrative from a mere recounting of events into a profound meditation on the nature of power, resistance, and memory. The use of irony and juxtaposition is equally critical, highlighting the stark contrast between official respectability and private cruelty, between opulent facades and hidden suffering. This constant interplay of opposites underscores the inherent contradictions and moral compromises that define the antebellum South. The audience-addressing style, where the narrator directly engages the viewer, "Welcome to this journey. What would you have done?" creates an intimate yet challenging relationship, positioning the audience not as passive observers but as active participants in the moral and historical inquiry. This direct address, strategically placed at key rhetorical points, ensures that the story's ethical implications resonate on a personal level. The narrative's conclusion, moving from the factual summary of Richard's ignominious end to broader philosophical reflections on human nature and systemic oppression, solidifies its role as a moral commentary. It encourages a critical examination of how power operates, how injustice persists, and how the quiet acts of individuals, even those born of vengeance, can profoundly disrupt and illuminate the dark corners of history, leaving an indelible, unsettling mark on the collective consciousness, compelling future generations to question what truths remain buried beneath layers of convenience and silence.